Welcome. No worries, the pandemic hasn't returned. We're only doing this once. I'm unable to do the lecture or first lecture in person this week, so I'm offering this lecture clip, and you will discuss the core readings in the seminar in our first week, which will have a little bit of a slower start because I am away. Welcome to the course. This is the Theory of History course, which I will both be teaching in Dutch and in English. And in our first class, we will introduce the topic that we're actually talking about, and we'll be looking at turns in academic research, the twists and turns of international history and IR, the two main disciplines that we'll be talking about a lot in this course. So what we'll be looking at international history. What is international history? What is IR theory? And what is the past? Important fundamental questions in this Theory of International History course, and we'll be looking at how different people have answered that questions at different points in time in different settings. What we want to think about in this course is key insights, key ideas in the study of history, in the study of international history, and in the study of IR theory. Now, what is the relation between IR theory and international history? That relationship is quite kind of murky, it's kind of difficult. History is a discipline that studies the past, and international history is a discipline that studies the international past, diplomatic history, international history, transnational history, and it's focused on how the past informs the present and how the international system that we know today came to be. IR theory is a different thing. IR theory is a social science that seeks to develop a theory about the international system, and different theories that have different main ideas, and then it seeks to test that theory. For instance, realism focuses on a zero-sum game, on actors being afraid of each other, and that creates a certain security situations. And that theory, those theories believe that they can define laws that govern the international system, that make the international system work. And then in a second step, they seek to test that theory, prove that theory by using historical examples, by using present day examples, which is a very, very different approach to the study of the international system, where one discipline, history, looks at the specific and seeks to come up with a general argument that is still rooted in a specific example. The history of French diplomatic interactions in the 50s, for instance. IR theory seeks to go the other direction. It seeks to develop a theory. The international system is governed by people who are afraid of each other, and then seeks to prove that with a host of examples. In the ancient Greek world, this happened in France, this happened, so my theory about the international system is correct. So both disciplines look at the international system, but they do so in very different ways. And what is important, and we'll talk about this throughout the course, is that a lot of the academic research is characterized by different turns, different methodological turns towards new ways of doing research, new ways of doing science in a different points in time. In the 90s, for instance, and we'll talk about this, more and more historians became enamored by the cultural turn, this notion that international relations could be studied by understanding what people believed, what they were thinking, and how they were representing ideas in international relations, which was a very, very different way of studying history, international history, than had been done up until that point. And it leads the writer of our handbook, or one of the key books that we were using, Malchow, to even ask if IR is a discipline at all. Is IR a discipline at all? Because international international relations theory seeks to seeks to develop major theories, but seems to be methodologically less certain about what it is doing. Where international history, diplomatic history, has a long tradition into the 19th century. IR theory is a fairly recent discipline, really developed in the 1930s. Where history really has roots in the 19th century. So it really leads Malchow to ask fundamental questions. But what we want to do in this course is think about the theory of history. What is it? What is that we as historians do when we write history, and how have other people written history, international history, and how is the relationship between international history and other disciplines that think about the international system or international relations? How has that relationship evolved, and what can that tell us about international history as a science? So what is international history? It leads us to the first real question: what is history? History can be many things, right? It can be oral. There can be an oral tradition of history. It can be written. That's what we do in the West most dominantly, or in the global North most dominantly. We write history and we work with written sources. But it can also be visual. An example of this is the Benin bronzes, which were created in the 16th century in the West African kingdom of Benin. And the kingdom of Benin ordered artists to really commemorate certain events in these plaques, in these bronze plaques. It is their way of writing history. So history can be many things, and we as historians have become very adept and very good at using different sources to write our material. So how is history then different from IR theory? Well, as Malchow sort of argues, he says history complicates. History makes things that seem self-evident about the international system. It likes to complicate that. An example of this is today we live in a world of nation states and international organizations. But what historians have become really good at recently is pointing out that the more dominant way of organizing the international system up until the 50s was actually empires, was actually imperial. The world we lived in not so long ago was a world of empires, and that realization then complicates what diplomacy was, how people did diplomacy, and it really sort of questions assumptions that we have. It's something historians really like to do. IR theorists seek the bigger picture. They seek the big picture, develop a theory, and then seek to prove that theory. It makes for a very different type of science. The second thing that Malchow indicates is that history does not repeat itself. We as historians know this, right? We don't believe that history comes in cycles. But history sort of happens uniquely at each point in time, and what we then are interested in is causation, right? How did something happen, and are there certain general ways that we can understand how history might happen, but still with the realization that history at each point in time can be very different. IR theorists tend to use history more as a toolbox to prove their theory, making for a fairly a shallow understanding of what history actually is as a discipline. So international history, diplomatic history can be many things like history, but it seeks to complicate, it seeks to think about the world in different ways. And since international history can be many different things, it's not surprising that there have been different methodologies to write diplomatic history. And when we go into the archive, what is it that we do? What do we look at? What do we ignore? How do we actually use this massive amount of sources that come at us in official national archives or in personal memoirs? How do we use this big stack of paper? It's a big question that requires a methodological response. And Malchow basically identifies three big methodological turns. These are really big turns. We'll talk about this in more detail later on. But he identifies sort of three big waves that methodologically have characterized the study of diplomatic history. Our first moment is, of course, the 19th century. Leopold von Ranke, the hero of every historian, of course, the man who made the argument that historians almost needed to be encyclopedic in their approach, had to reproduce the past as it was. Bloß sagen, wie es eigentlich gewesen, which is this cry for history not simply as a literary effort, but as a genuine science, a science understood in the 19th century version of it, namely very encyclopedic, rooted in archives, and very much an attempt to reproduce the past in a scientific way. He's also the man who introduced, of course, seminar teaching, where he brought documents into the classroom and trained historians to work with these documents and reproduce the past. So the problem that approach created, right, as incredibly important as it was, and we still as historians strive to accurately work with documents, right? We don't want to misrepresent what is in the documents. We don't strive to create literature. We do strive to work with documents and produce a historical narrative that is rooted in the documents and can be checked. Right? If we use footnotes, we do want people to check our footnotes. As important as that was for the development of history as a science, it produced the issue of essentially, boring, unintellectual history. It is the question that G.M. Young puts forward. How can we go beyond recording what one clerk wrote to another? How can we write international history that is more than that? And the answer to that question increasingly came in the 1920s, 30s, and as remained strong until the 1970s, is the emergence of what Malchow calls the modernist movement of history. A movement in history represented most principally by the Annales School and Mark Bloch and Fernand Braudel, of course, who want to absorb social science ideas, social history into the writing of history. They also don't want to focus simply on the international, the Außenpolitik that Ranke was so obsessed by. They also want to think about how internal components, internal politics shape international relations, shape international history. And the Annales School in France obviously is instrumental in this. They really focus on integrating social science methodologies into their writing of history. But still this type of history remains problematic. It's still fairly elitist. It still focuses very much on the West. It still focuses very much on what big men are doing. And that really changes in the 1960s, where with the emergence of the New Left, the hippie movement, the anti-war movement, as the Vietnam War breaks out, anti-war protests, this free spirit of the 1960s, and the emergence of new ideas and a new enthusiasm about Marxism, neo-Marxism, produces histories that focus on the working class, focus on how normal people, regular people, also shape history. Instrumental in this is E.P. Thompson, who wrote The Making of the English Working Class. He really sort of gave us as historians, but also international historians, very much stressed the importance of looking at how Marxist ideas shaped history. Another person that we'll talk about later on is Eric Hobsbawm, which you know undoubtedly because he wrote Age of Extremes, this big classic book about how international history and history is shaped by social forces and by Marxism. So it's really this plea to look beyond elites, beyond the social changes, abstract social changes that were happening, which is what what the Annales School put forward, really look at the way people live their lives and how these lives then shape history. Right, we methodologically, when we talk about methodology is this question of what do we pay attention to when we write history, and each of these movements says, well, hold on, you should be looking at this, because if you really want to understand history, this is the key driver of the historical process, which is an incredibly interesting dialogue that we'll dive into more and more as the course progresses. Important in this is to also think about non-Western conceptions of history and of international history, and in that sense, we can sort of look at how African history, modern African history, is written. When we look at histories of Ghana's diplomacy, for instance, the independent nation of Ghana that became independent in 57. We see history written as a tragedy, right? The question is always why does this sort of project of post-colonial international power, of international influence, why does that not really come into fruition later on in the 70s? And that is then what historians seek to do, right? They write their history as a tragedy, trying to understand why things fail. And this, I mean, today at African universities, historians do new things, different things, but for a very long time, the African conception of history, of historical writing, when it came to African nationalism, was one in which African history is conceptualized as a tragedy. So methodologically different turns in history. And this brings us to the field-defining essay that Carr wrote, namely, What is History? In 1962. It's an essay, it's a set of lectures in which he tries to define what history is as a discipline. History more broadly, but also, of course, important for understanding what diplomatic history is, what international history is. And he highlights elements that are important in historical methodology, something the historian should do or shouldn't do. As in the first case, the historian shouldn't cherry pick, right? You shouldn't. What historians do is they go to the archive, they develop a thesis, or they should develop a thesis, and they should then try and see if the archive backs up the argument they're trying to make. In trying to back up that argument, the tendency, or it's often very tempting to cherry pick your argument, to take elements that prove what you want to say, and to ignore elements that aren't really in line with what you want to say. The good historian is able to take the evidence that confirms his or her point, and take the evidence that refutes his or her point, but think about how that counter evidence actually works well for his argument at the same time. But don't cherry pick your documents, don't cherry pick your evidence. The second thing that Carr raises in the 60s is know the historian, right? Which at that point is really revolutionary. The notion that you take a position, that there's a positionality that you as a historian have that affects how you write, what you write, and what you choose to argue. So knowing the historian is important to know the argument if you want to evaluate what historians do and how they do it. The third point he raises is that history is not what Ranke thought it was, right? International history is not what Ranke thought what it was. It wasn't a reproduction of the past, but it is a never-ending dialogue with the past, and each generation has a new dialogue with that past. What does that mean concretely? It is no coincidence that with the increasing ease of air travel in the 2000s, the emergence of international organizations, the end of the Cold War, the emergence of new international actors on the international stage, the rise of the internet. It is no coincidence then that our histories have become more transnational, have become more international, have been less histories of the diplomacy of one country towards another country, and have been more focused on how international organizations shape international history, how non-state actors do diplomacy. It is no coincidence that this has happened, because it's something that in the present caught our attention, and then we asked the question, well, how did this happen in the past? So this is very important if we also want to understand why these methodological turns happen. Uh, um, uh, to go back to our previous example, in the 60s, because there's such an attention for Marxism, for the New Left, all of a sudden historians begin to realize that working class people, normal people who work normal jobs, actually also play an important role in history. So it's history is never just simply the past. Writing history, is a dialogue between the present and the past. And the last thing that Carr raises is that causation is not necessarily the same as learning from history. What we as historians are interested in is to understand how specific events happened, and how yeah, why did the First World War happen? What is the chain of events leading up to the French Revolution? Right? Can we compare this to other revolutions? What are the differences? What are the similarities? Then in itself, we try to understand sort of what causation is, why things happen, which is very different from some of what his predecessors, Carr's predecessors or colleagues were doing. As somebody like Arnold Toynbee wrote. Wrote about how civilizations were born out of more primitive societies, and how this shouldn't be seen as a result of racial or environmental factors, but as a response to challenges such as hard country, new ground, blows and pressures from other civilizations, right? Which is a very different conception of history, right? What somebody like Toynbee tried to do is to come up with laws of history. This is something that Carr is very critical of. What we try to do is we try to think about causation, we try to think about and explain why things happen, but we never, as historians, never try and understand or never try and give a general theory of history. As historians, we're very wary of this. Which doesn't mean that we can't do science, right? Thinking about causation, thinking about how events happens, why things happen, is a scientific endeavor, um, uh, and coming up with general theories of history just isn't. And this is something that Carr raises in his lectures, when he thinks about what history is. So don't cherry pick the evidence. Know your positionality. History is a never-ending dialogue with the past, not just as a simple reproduction of what we have in the documents, and the importance of thinking about history as understanding the cause of things, and not necessarily coming up with a big theory of history. And that a focus on causation, trying to explain why things happen in diplomatic history settings, has often led to thinking about blame. Who is to blame for the First World War? Who is to blame for the Cold War? And these are big debates that really shaped diplomatic history discussions, and they were admittedly unproductive discussions. Who is to blame for World War One? Germany, Austria, Russia, the Great Britain. Well, those are unproductive questions. These questions became more productive when we started thinking about causation more flexibly, the emergence of nationalism, the emergence of a culture that really celebrated war, right? Those are elements that can help us explain why the First World War happened. But for a long time, historians invested a lot of time in trying to find someone to blame for World War One. Similarly, with the emergence of the Cold War, who started the Cold War, three main groups of historians emerged. In the 1950s, we had Orthodox historians who blamed the Soviet Union and who saw the United States as fighting an aggressive Soviet Union. Revisionists in the 1960s saw the Soviet Union as the victim and the US as the instigator of violence. And in the 1970s, we had post-revisionists who took a more balanced approach and talked about the US and the Soviet Union both as empires with imperial ambitions, making them both responsible for the Cold War. But these blame questions, as I've indicated, weren't really productive scientific questions for history, and that sort of changed in the 1990s, already in the 1980s, when new diplomatic history emerged, and international history emerged. What is new diplomatic history? New diplomatic history tries to think more broadly about how to explain changes in the international system. Incredibly important is the emergence of the cultural turn. We'll talk about this later. The cultural turn, where cultural elements, feminism, ideas about gender, ideas about ideologies, are all looked at to come to a broader explanation of why international events happen. And this was really this new diplomatic history is really a way to make diplomatic history relevant again, because as Malchow indicates in his book, diplomatic history at some point became sort of a marginal enterprise in the history profession that was dominated by the social sciences, by social history, by Marxist history. Doing diplomatic history was not considered to be interesting because it was essentially diplomats writing one another. And the cultural turn in the 1990s really saves diplomatic history from itself in many ways, because it really broadens the view. Important in this later on in the 2000s is the emergence of transnational and international history, a global history, and the notion that we shouldn't only study the diplomacy of one country towards another, but that we can think about how different countries together create an international system. That we can think about how non-state actors can do diplomacy, and create a history that is beyond the nation, that is transnational. So all these things really gave international history the appeal that it has today. From debates about blame have shifted now towards more holistic attempts to think about causation and why things happen. So what then is IR theory? Well, IR theory is international relations theory. It's a part of political science. It tends to be more predictive. At least the older IR theories, realism, liberalism, were both theories that made a claim that they could find or distill laws in which laws of the international system, so find ways in which the international system worked, and then predict what people would do in a certain setting. An example of this is realism, that makes the argument that people are fundamentally afraid of one another, and that this will ultimately lead to a security dilemma, that people will inevitably come into conflict with each other, and that this will always be the case at each moment in history. And it is it's very theoretical, as the name itself it says, right? People develop IR theorists develop a theory and then seek to prove that theory, which as historians that write diplomatic history, we work the other way around in a way, right? We work with documents, with cases, and then try to come up with an explanation for the case that we are presented with. This obsession with causation. So IR theory also has a relationship with war in a way, and not necessarily with blame, but with trying to prevent that war. The first IR department was created in the aftermath of World War I in Aberystwyth in the United Kingdom, as a conscious effort to try and try and determine why war happened, why do wars happen, trying to define laws of war, and to see if we then can prevent wars from happening. The Cold War meant a big boost. The Cold War, the struggle between the Soviet Union and the United States from the 1940s onwards, really meant a big boost for IR theory, because it really sort of revived this interest in trying to prevent war, particularly since with the arrival of the atomic bomb, the atomic weapon, war would have even more devastating consequences. Now, what is important to note is that IR theory, or political theory, political science, has two very different iterations. One of them is the more classical British historicism versus the American scientism. It's the difference between political theory versus a predictive social science, where the British still today don't really talk about political science. They don't talk about IR theory. They talk about IR theory. They rather tend to talk about political theory, which is sort of a mixture of history, political science, political theory, philosophy, into a more more theoretical, speculative discipline. Right, where it's sort of the British European tradition of political theory versus the American scientific political science tradition. This argument that political science is a science that can help determine how people why people make decisions and how to influence that decision. And this really comes at the cusp of a behaviorism that really revolutionized the discipline of political science in the 1950s. This notion that you can try and come up with certain ways in which people behave. You can sort of predict how people behave, and there's certain laws in which people and international systems behave. And this understanding of political science as a real science that can predict behavior really has to be understood in the context of the aftermath of World War II, when PR, psychology, all these sort of studies of the human mind really go through a revolution, and people really begin to embrace the notion that these are sciences. They aren't just a part of philosophy or theory, and they're different distinct disciplines with different methodologies, and that it is actually possible to predict people's behavior. This is a very American conception of political science. As said, right, in the United Kingdom, we still talk more about political theory than we talk about anything else. Now, it is very clear that IR theory and diplomatic history sort of have a joint they have a joint history. They have a similar topic of study. So people have been in the midst of a discussion about what the correct relationship between these two disciplines should be. An important contribution to this discussion is Gordon Alexander Craig, who is the president of the American Historical Association, and he in his speech, he really sort of puts forward two main ideas, namely that both disciplines should learn from each other. Political science should appreciate more what he calls le milieu et le moment, so should really appreciate more that the fact that international events happen at a certain time in a certain place, and that it's very difficult to come up with very general laws for the international system, and that diplomatic historians should be more in tune with the fact that it is possible to come up with big histories, big systemic interpretations of the international system, that you don't only have to look at small events and then write histories about those. In a way, Gordon Alexander Craig makes this argument that IR and international history sit on a spectrum of, on the one hand, you have detail, you have the moment, you have history, and then the other you have big theory, not really rooted in any sort of particular historical moment. And in an ideal world, we would both, IR theorists and international historians, in an ideal world, we should do both. We should be anti-heretical and take time and place into account. So IR theory and diplomatic history, very different theoretical basis that sort of try and come together at different moments in different times. Since this is an international history course, we also need to, in a third instance, talk about what the past is. What is history and what is the past? Are these two things the same? Are they different? I mean, they are, right? But how are they different? and what are ways to think about the past that then can also help us inform our diplomatic history writing or international history writing. A few things that we'll talk about. We'll first talk about the historical sensation and the past. What is the past? What is history? And then we'll talk about four types of past, four different ways in which we can think about the past. And we'll sort of reflect on how these different ways help us construct the past or an understanding of the past and write history. So is the past the same as historical reality? In our everyday speech, it is, but in our discipline, in our science, the science that we do, it isn't. Historical reality is something that we as historians create. We're very aware of this, based on the remnants that are still left in the archive or in the oral tradition. We create a historical reality, which isn't necessarily the same as the past. The past happened in the past, and we can never really get at that past. The only thing that we can do is we can create historical reality. Nevertheless, right, there's this sort of enjoyment of the past that we have, as something that Huizinga already pointed out. When we come into contact with documents, with historical buildings, there is this sensation, this feeling of being in direct contact with the past, which obviously is an illusion, right? It's not true, right? Even the document in the archive has been processed, has been provided with a new context, has been turned into something else than what it was in the past, right? The letter, the diplomatic telegram that we find in the archive comes to us in a very, very different context than it came to the diplomat who actually wrote the telegram or read the telegram. But we still have this sort of historical sensation, this emotion when we study the archive, when we come into contact with the past. But the past and historical reality are not necessarily the same. And this also sort of gives us pause when we think about conceptions of time, right? How does time happen? Is time chronological? Isn't it chronological? And people have had different ideas about this. A different conception of time was proposed by Einstein in 1905 in his theory of relativity, where he suggests that time is essentially just a fourth dimension. That isn't absolute. So he launches this notion that theoretically we would be able to travel back in time, and that the past in that sense isn't necessarily done and over with and the past, which is a very interesting theoretical notion that we borrow from theoretical physics. It's something that we sort of try and ignore when we write history, where we have very chronological historians are obsessed with what came first, what came second, but in Einstein's conception of time, that doesn't really exist, right? Time is a fourth dimension, is a space that we could theoretically travel. Another important conception of time, of course, is Fernand Braudel's conception of time that emerges in his La Méditerranée et la Monde Méditerranée à l'époque de Philippe II, his big work that he wrote while he was a prisoner of war in the 1940s, where he writes about history happening in the Mediterranean, and he sort of makes this argument where he says, well, changes that happen don't happen everywhere at the same time, and they don't affect people in the same way, right? Does somebody who herds goats in Greece, is this person affected in the same way by the French Revolution or by the changes that happen in the time period of Philip II? The political changes that happen, does that affect this person's life a lot? No, right? I mean, a political era might have changed, but the social situation that this person who herds goats is in doesn't really change all that much. So it gives us pause, and it gives us a way to think about time and changes happening. The notion that these things can happen at different points at different times to different people at different places, and not necessarily everything changes with one breaking moment. The French Revolution doesn't immediately change politics, economics, and social realities. Even something as fundamental as the French Revolution doesn't affect everybody's life at the same time, and doesn't end certain periods in history at the same point in time. So it's interesting to think about this, right? Our the historical sensation that we feel when we get in touch with artifacts from the past is at its best is an illusion, because what we do as historians is we create historical reality, and even our chronological conception of time that we sort of intuitively seem to feel is something that we need to think about, is something that isn't necessarily a reality, and can be also rooted in a Western tradition. There are different conceptions of time in different places at different points in time. So our first conception of the past is the chronological past. It's the most simple past that we have. There is the past, there is future. 1945, 1946, right? Years happen, time goes by, and there's no way to get back into the past. Important in that respect is the notion of historical distance. We as historians think about the need to have some distance from the past. Is it possible to write a history of what happened yesterday? As historians, we sort of tend to think that that is not really a thing. Why is that difficult? Well, let's turn to Friedrich Schleiermacher, who talks about the importance of distance. He talks about the importance of effective distance, the distance that you have to have from something that happened 2 days ago. You're still emotionally invested. You have certain ideas about what happened. You don't necessarily get I mean, you're part of that history still. So is that something that you are already able to analyze from a rational standpoint? Somebody like Schleiermacher and a lot of other historians would say no, right? There's too much of an emotional connection with what just happened. The second is a discursive distance, is this need to see the bigger picture. What we get from the archive, what we get from a little bit of a distance, is that we can often recontextualize things that happened in a very different way. An example of this is the invasion of Ukraine by the Russians, which now seems to be the biggest story. It might as well be possible that in 10 years' time, 20 years' time, we talk about this war simply as one moment in the big climate change transition, where people finally realized that you need to put solar panels on your roof, that you need to minimize your consumption of energy to save the planet. Right? This is something that we don't yet know. Right? We do not understand how the invasion of Ukraine relates to other changes that are happening at the same time, because we don't have that bigger picture yet. So there's the emotional distance, and there is the need for some bigger picture thinking. Then there's the complicated past, the notion that the past seems to be very foreign sometimes, seems to be very different. When we read things from the 50s, we tend to not really recognize ourselves in what people were saying in the 50s or in the 19th century. Ideas about race, ideas about gender, those tend to be things that we don't really think about in that similar way today. So that leads historians to think about epochs, historicism, the need to understand what actors were saying within their time frame. If a certain actor says something that we find reprehensible today, we need to really understand if that historical actor, if what he was saying was commonplace already, or if it was already contested at that point in time. To really understand the past in its correct context, or else we commit the crime of presentism. We're projecting back ideas we have today into the past, and that is something that historians do not like doing. this also comes with the notion that once a time period is over and done, then that's the end of it. So the 19th century is never coming back. That's a closed off era that we can then study as a very Rankian way of thinking about the past. That is done over with, and we can study that as something foreign, as something different. It's not the world we live in today anymore. It's the past. A more complex way of thinking about this is in terms of layers. The notion that historical time periods don't necessarily end as neatly as you would want them to do. And again, I'm returning to Brodel, to Brodel's masterpiece talking about the long term, the medium term, and the short term processes of history. Things might change in the short term, but longer term ideas might seep into other time periods. The long 19th century, ideas about how to do good science that are 19th century ideas still pop up in the 1930s. Ideas about race that have been formulated in the 18th century come back to us in the 1930s and the 1950s in different ways, right? So time doesn't really necessarily fit into neat time blocks. Processes can stretch over centuries and can end or begin again, and that this is a more complex way of thinking about history. Then there's the strange past, the complicated past, the past that is very different to us. So a good example of this is the conception of the Middle Ages. The people in the Renaissance thought about the Middle Ages as a dark period, supposedly as a dark period, and they could not really conceptualize of it as something different. I mean, there's historical research that questions this sort of notion, right? But it was an important, or it was an interesting notion that existed, right? So, but that way of thinking about the Middle Ages is, as Fasolt says, is a deliberate act. It doesn't really say anything about the past. It says more about the person who thinks about the past. It's a deliberate act to distance yourself from the past. You are not, right? You are not a racist in the 1950s U.S. South. You are not an anti-feminist thinker in the 30s, right? It is a deliberate act of distancing yourself from a past that is strange and different, right? That's a strange past, and it is not, right? Again, it doesn't necessarily mean that the past was very different. It does mean that you as an actor want to distance yourself deliberately from that past. Ankerschmidt has a bit of a different interpretation of this. He talks about tragic self-mutilation. He talks about how people in the past can have a certain intention, right? They can sort of make a certain decision because they think if they make a decision, something will happen, and then unintended consequences happen. People don't always control this process, control the process of decision making further on. And when they then look back, they say, "Oh, I should have made a different decision." But in the past, I thought differently about things. So that way of thinking about the past is something different, something strange, is less of a deliberate act in Ankerschmidt's conception. He gives people less agency in deciding what the past is, which I find a more interesting conception of the past, to be honest, because right, we always tend to think about the past as strange, but do we as historians have enough of a distance or enough evidence to really understand what this historical actor wanted to do and the unintended consequences that flowed from a certain decision? So I find that a more interesting conception of history. So the past is strange, but again, that strangeness of the past isn't a reflection of that past, it's more a reflection of the historian and what he thinks about that past. Tying this back into the car, knowing your positionality when you write history. Then there's the present past, this notion that words or terms or ideas from the past tend to affect the way we write history today, the way we think about history today. What is interesting, and this is not mentioned in the contribution, is that there's also a post-colonial conception of time, a notion developed by anti-colonial intellectuals like Aimé Césaire, who's a Trinidadi thinker in the French Empire, and these post-colonial thinkers tend to think about the past not as the past, but as something that continuously shapes the present. And as the present changes, the past also changes in numerous ways. So the way you have to understand this is fairly straightforward, in the sense that colonial oppression created a situation that affects people today, and we can only know how that colonial past affected people as the present goes on, because the past has sort of new ways of affecting the present day in ways that you wouldn't expect, or that you wouldn't know necessarily, you couldn't necessarily predict in the past. And this sort of is an interesting post-colonial take on how the past shapes the present, without even having any control over it. So the present past is an interesting conception also of time, because it shows that history isn't necessarily neat blocks that follow on one another, but the past shapes the present in unpredictable ways, and it's something that we as historians have to be very conscious about when we write history, particularly this type of post-colonial history. Right, so when we construct a past, it is important to know what type of past we are looking at, and to be aware that we can construct a past in different ways, as complicated, as strange, or as still affecting the present. And as a historian, we have to be aware that these things happen when we write a history book, even when we do diplomatic history. So in conclusion, international history is a continuous dialogue with the past. The way we think about the international system today really affects how we write about the past. The emergence of the internet really gave us an incentive to think about the past in more transnational, international ways, something that didn't happen before the internet in the 90s. And international history is less interested in grand theorizing and more interested in unique historical circumstances and causation, rather than IR theory, which is more interested in developing big theories about the international system that we as historians then can use to maybe think or inform our history writing. But it's something that we're very cautious about, very skeptical about. So the construction of the past as historians is something that we need to think about, and it's something that we'll do in this course and in the seminar that you will have next Friday, or depending on when you have this course.